Welcome, everybody. We're excited to have you here for our roundtable event on rolling forecasts brought to you by Plan Buddies. Before we get started, we're going to have a quick countdown here, and then we'll jump into the agenda. I mostly just like to listen to that music, so I play it. No, welcome. We see Veronique out there from hot Texas. Yes, I'm in relatively hot Utah, probably not as hot as Texas. But if you're out there listening, please let us know where you're coming from. All right, we got Jorge from Tijuana, Mexico. So welcome, Jorge. Please, again, if you're out there, let us know where you're coming from. I know we have people on multiple platforms. We got StreamYard, we got LinkedIn, we got YouTube. So feel free to let us know what platform you're coming from, what you hope to gain from today. So why don't we start by doing a quick round of introductions? I'm guessing most of you know me. My name is Paul Barnhurst. I'm known as the FP&A guy. I'm fortunate enough to have with me my two co-founders, Laurent and Derek, for Plan Buddies. And today I'm going to grill them, host a roundtable discussion about rolling forecasts. But before we jump into that, we got Kimberly joining us from Wisconsin. Got another one from Mexico City. You can see him coming up on the screen. Veronique says Mexico has been hotter than Texas. They're both too hot for me. So that's all I need to say on that. So why don't we start by going around and doing the rest of these introductions? Laurent, tell us about yourself.
Hi, thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Liran Edelist, for those who don't know, had fortunate enough to work with Paul and Derek on establishing Plan Buddies over the past couple of months in the FP&A space for over 25 years, so almost since my childhood. Just kidding, of course. I'm happy everything about business planning, enterprise planning, entrepreneurial, and the technology around it.
Great. Well, thank you, Laurent. Derek, he's the baby of the group.
I am the young blood. I am Derek Baker. I work at a company called Circle, which is what we use to host the community platform right now, Plan Buddies. So we're using Circle as our software vendor for that. And I've been in FP&A for almost 4 years. So I'm pretty early in my career getting started. And the reason why I love the idea of Plan Buddies is because I've seen how much community has helped me in my FP&A career so far. Getting to know Paul. Paul has made a lot of introductions for me throughout the last several years that we've known each other, and taking that community and being able to bring it to more people through our online community of Plan Buddies is something that I really want to do. And it's been really helpful for me as we've been building it out. And I think we've been able to help a few other people as well that have joined the community.
Yep. So we love that. That's why we do these events. They're all part of our Plan Buddies community. And our vision and goal is to create the #1 planning community globally. That's what we're working toward. And if you're not a member, we'd love for you to check it out. You can always join. And today we're going to focus on rolling forecasts. Before I do that, I know we have a few other people out there. I can see the numbers. So please let us know where you're coming from if you haven't yet. And then also feel free to let us know what you hope to get out of today. If you have a question about rolling forecasts, throw them in the comments and we'll get to them before we're done. But I'm going to start the questions here. Derek, why do we need rolling forecasts? We have a budget. What's the benefit of a rolling forecast from your perspective?
I think that the major benefit of rolling forecasts is that they can be dynamic as the company changes. When we set budgets, we often set them with 1 year in mind, maybe even reforecast every quarter. But with a rolling forecast, usually that implies that it's rolling on a certain cadence, weekly, monthly. And when we can roll forward the forecast, we can see changes that are happening in the business in shorter timeframes than every quarter, every year, because business is changing more frequently than those cadences. So I think that's why it's really important, is so we have just a more up-to-date view of how the business is trending and what direction we're heading.
Makes a lot of sense. Laurent, your thoughts on that? I mean, from your career and what you've seen, why are rolling forecasts important?
Well, it was sometimes ago. It used to be a debate. Do we need any forecast? Like, isn't it enough to have all this budgeting headache once a year and then just keep moving until the next budgeting season is arriving? That's no longer true. I think we are living in such a dynamic reality, environment, business, technology, everything around us. If we are not having rolling forecast, we're not really getting a better or good understanding of what is happening in our company. So rolling forecast, number one, is really our indicator. How are we doing and how we should be changing. And
Appreciate that. And I see we've had a few other people join us. So Carolina, welcome. We got Eric, we got Derek here monitoring some of the comments, helping us out. I'm used to kind of monitoring them and talking. So this is different for me. I'm going to be like, oh, I have someone that can do that. But one thing I'll share when it, kind of comes to rolling forecasts is just think about your own budget. You start the year and think, hey, I'm going to make a certain amount of money. If you got a promotion, something changed, you would adjust your forecast for the year. Like if a big car expense came and all of a sudden you had to buy a new car, you're probably going to look to reduce spending elsewhere. You may not always map that out like we do in a company. Or if you think of supply chain planning, I guarantee you if there's a change in the economy, they're adjusting all that. You don't want a lot of leftover inventory. And as planning becomes more and more company-wide, they're hung together. A lot of times the financial wasn't connected to the operational. It becomes even more and more important that you're updating that financial and that it's all flowing together. And as Laurent said, just look at the world right now. We are in a different world than we were before. And the amount of change and uncertainty over the last couple of years, interest rates, inflation, so many other things. It's more important than ever. So we're going to go to a question. I think this gets to what Vernique asked. Derek, you've been at what, 3 or 4 companies now in your career and a few internships as well. I'm guessing you've seen rolling forecasts at a number of them. You probably implemented some of that process. So what have you typically seen? Maybe talk a little bit of how you've seen rolling forecasts work or how you've implemented them yourself.
Yeah, this is something we're going to talk more about later this month in our FP&A for Startups event. So just a quick plug for that. But I think the question is like, how do rolling forecasts fit inside of the broader FP&A cycle? Because we still make budgets at the FP or at my startups I worked at every year. But as the market changes, as you learn more about your startup, you have to make changes to the way that you go to market, the way that you price things, and that budget becomes stale really, really quickly. And so rolling forecasts are super important at startups because it seems like every month there is something that's changing, a key assumption that's changing, whether that's the way that you're pricing, the way that you're selling the product. Maybe you introduce a freemium model, something like that. And so the models are very dynamic and they are changing all the time in a startup. And so having rolling forecasts that you can update every month without having to dig into every single expense line item or things like that is really helpful. And the way that I went about this was making sure that there are drivers attached to all of the most important parts of the forecast. So I try to follow the 80-20 rule. There are certain line items that you don't need a driver for, and you can just forecast it as a rolling 3-month average or a % of revenue or something simple like that. But for the really important things like your hosting expenses or your headcount or things like that, attaching a driver is the best way to build these rolling forecasts in a way that isn't taking hours and hours and hours each month.
Yeah, there's understanding your assumptions, building a driver. If a rolling forecast is taking you a week to do, you probably need to simplify your model or think about it. And we'll get more into that. But Ron, what have you seen? And you've seen companies implement them. What have you typically seen work? And then I'll follow that up with another question, but I'll start there.
I have actually a secret formula for the forecast process. Well, in a couple of minutes, it's not going to be a secret anymore, right?
Getting ready, go. Secret. Get my notes.
So, the best practice, only 4 stages. This is what we need to make sure if you want to have a proper process for our rolling forecast. The first one, and this is very much aligned with what Derek said, we always want to start forecast with a bottom-up collections of data, but not just the financial data. That's easy. The financial drivers or the operational drivers, right? So that's stage number one. If you're not collecting your operational driver, I would say probably not the best forecast, because you can't really get insights into the business. So that's stage number one. Second stage, you want to calculate not only the financial results, but also your KPIs. KPIs are important because, again, KPI are telling you, are you meeting really your business plans? Is that really in alignment with your strategy, right? So stage number two, calculating KPIs and financial results. The third stage here is, what are the executives have to say for that data collections? Do they believe in that? Is it looking good to them? Do they want to reallocate resource to do some other type of executive decisions around that? And once we did those three stages, the fourth stage is the easiest one. That's our baseline for next month. That's it. 4 stages. You start bottom up, collect drivers, calculating KPIs, executive actions, and that's the baseline for next month. As easy as it sounds, that's how it should be.
I like it. So I'll share a little bit of my experience. I worked at American Express. When I came in, we had rolling forecasts, but they were almost not quite as painful, but they were often as painful as the budgeting cycle. When I first came in, we went through a full-blown forecast. It was a 12-week process. We did them once a quarter. So it took a good portion of the year, in that you'd start them a month before, you'd finish them a little bit after the quarter, probably about 8 weeks. And the company realized that was just too long. That was not an efficient way to do a rolling forecast. And so we went to an R&O process with a rolling forecast, where we said, just focus on the high-level risks and opportunities. And I've rolled that in at other companies, because it's a great way to find the balance. Because I think, and I'll get your guys' thoughts, and I'd love thoughts from the guests. What happens sometimes is that forecast becomes detailed and it just becomes too much work. So it's finding that right balance. It shouldn't take you away from supporting the business. It should help you support the business and figure out what's changed. So Derek, I kind of mentioned that. Any thoughts there on what I just said about that, of kind of R&Os and how you ensure that the forecasts don't take over managing the business if you go to a rolling forecast? And you're on mute, Derek. So I'm sure whatever you said was wonderful, but we didn't hear it.
Thanks. I think the risks and opportunities method is a really good one, especially if you're at a really big business and there's a lot of things that are changing within different business units or different departments. It's a way to simplify that and just focus on the things that actually matter, and without having to reforecast the budget every single month. That said, that method isn't as helpful for me in my companies at startups, where we're doing less than 100 million in revenue. And our models, we focus a lot on making them dynamic and easy to update, so that we're not spending days or weeks reforecasting each month. I think there's a good post from Chris Riley on LinkedIn about, if your model is taking more than a few hours to update every month, you built a really bad model. And he's talking about specifically in Excel, and FP&A tools do a lot to get rid of those headaches. But yeah, I think they're in the risks and opportunities methodology, you focus on the things that actually matter. Like, did our North region miss their sales quota? And you add that in as a risk. Or did our one business line outperform their expectations? You add that in as opportunity. I think that makes a lot of sense when you have a lot of complexity in your business model.
And yeah, no, I agree. And I'm just going to address this comment here from Vernique, and then we'll come to you, Laurent. Unfortunately, our rolling forecasts were detailed. We had to have numbers for each account line. Vernique, I worked at a company where they made us do current year plus 36 months at a detailed level, including loading to account lines, the head count and the revenue and everything. And there was no value, in my view, going that far out. And so that's something I would love to get the thoughts. How far do you think is kind of a good range to go out when you're doing a rolling forecast? I mean, should you go out 12 months, 18 months, 6 months? Any thoughts on that, or at least how should you think about that? We'll start with you, Laurent.
I want to be kind of a little bit unstandard in my answer, but most companies are doing just for the current fiscal year, which is it's a very easy way, but in many industries, I think there are missing opportunities with using current year only. I like the concept of 13 months. So the idea is that you're always using the data that you already had in order to focus the next year as well. What I'm trying to say, let's take an easy example here. Let's think about retail companies. We're just a couple of days after Memorial Weekend. Retailer learned something out of Memorial Weekend, right? Have they been meeting their expectation? Did they give too many discounts, too little? What there were kind of main insights around that? If we take a standard retailer that is doing, let's say, budgeting on a fiscal and that is equal to the calendar year, that means that all the information, all the data they grab over the past Memorial Weekend will not be really useful for them for the next year planning, because it will take a couple of months until budgeting season start, and then you go through different KPIs, and sometimes all the data you collected from just a couple of days ago is disappearing. However, if we are building our forecast in the concept of rolling 12 or 13 months, you will be able to use the current data, your current information, for a bit longer period, and use that sort of an experience for a better projections on a rolling 12 months basis. So I like this concept, but with that being said, it definitely depends on the size of the company, the growth, the driver, the maturity, and many other factors, but definitely something to consider that not many companies are doing.
Derek, what's your thoughts? Do you have a kind of a preference or a way to think about how far out you should go with the rolling forecast?
My philosophy for, again, cash burning startups is you should forecast out however long you want your runway to be plus 6 months, because you need 6 months notice to do fundraising. So that's my personal philosophy for a cash burning startup. I think for profitable companies, you should forecast for whatever time period you actually think you can affect now. I would be surprised if you actually can make changes today that impact longer than 18 months out. Beyond that, I think that's just a guess. That said, I like to build my models out three plus years, but I don't actually forecast longer than 18 months. And then everything from month 19 beyond, we use what I like to call out year levers, which is its own separate part of the model where we're like, this is where we want to go long term, and it's modeled completely differently than the way that we model the first 12 to 18 months. So that's how I handle that, because I like to look out long term and have a sense of where we're going directionally as a business, and how is what's happening in the next 18 months impacting that long term vision.
Yeah, but you just got to that next question. So I think what you're going to hear here is everybody's going to have a little different opinion. A lot of it comes from the industry and your experience. Most of mine, like I said, I had the one company where we did 3 years out. It was always current year plus 3. When I was at American Express, we did high level planning, but the actual plan and rolling forecast were just current year. I tend to like something of at least 12 months out. Sometimes you might need longer. I definitely think 3 years is too long. I wouldn't, especially at a detailed level. I think high level assumptions, that's fine to kind of give some general ideas, because there's times when you may need it, which I kind of gets into that high level strategic planning, right? Do you do that as part of your forecast? You do that separate. And a really small company, I think startup, it's probably a lot of it's kind of lumped together a lot of times in the way it works. Bigger companies, I think can sometimes be very distinguished processes with corporate managing it and all those things. But in general, I think your forecast, for my opinion, is 12, 18 months is probably typically about right. And I want to get to the question you put up there from Santiago for a minute. We'll go to this one's. There you go. Be part of a global network. We'll come back to that one. Santi. Yep. Thank you. How do you integrate rolling forecasts made in November or December with the budget planning for the new year? I see Carolina added some thoughts on that. I think Vernique did. Why don't we go with you first on this, Laurent? What's your thoughts?
I think that's it's a nice segue to discuss a little bit about the differences between budget and forecast. The way I see budget, I see budget as a strategic plan. and the budget is more about what am I going to do within the next period. Traditionally the next period is 1 year, but budget could be for a specific project motion or maybe for a couple of years. So I'm not necessarily a big fan of taking the forecast at the end of the year and say that forecast will change or make last minute change in our budget, because the budget should be somehow approved around October, November, and that should have the high level plans for the next year. So unless something very radical was happening in the course of business, I would say the forecast of Q4 is literally to make sure that we are in alignment with our prediction to the year end. If we need to let our investors, shareholders, management knows that something is not really as expected, we need to raise a flag. But then again, like with any other forecast, it doesn't necessarily have to impact the budget unless it's radical. So budget should be the strategic plan, should be the strategic allocations of resources, and the forecast is just an indicator, are we doing fine? And of course, if we're not doing fine, we need to revisit the budget.
And I'll add a thought here, and then I'll go to you, Derek. I kind of take a little different approach. I do agree 100% your budget is your strategic for the next year. I think it makes a lot of sense to take whatever your last rolling forecast is for the budget and have that be your starting place from a system, from a data, but then you still need to have those discussions and make sure you build in the budget. So just from a practical standpoint, I've always seen, hey, let's just roll whatever that last forecast is, start there. Then you have your discussions and build everything in before you present to management, which often has the strategic. You need to have those conversations with them. So I think there's a mix of what Laurent's talking about here and also kind of the practical of how do you get all the data in, how do you start it? And again, it depends on system and Excel. But I think your last forecast is in many ways a natural place to start the conversation, but you need to keep in mind the strategic, because the forecast is always what do we as finance, it should be, what do we think is going to happen? Sometimes that's not what happens when management says, hold it to budget or do this or do that. And you're like, but there's no chance that's ever going to happen. Who's ever been there? I know I have, where you're like, keep the numbers the same. And you're looking at it going, okay, I'll keep them, but there's no chance in this, on this earth that that's happening. So that's what I'll say there. Derek, your take on this question.
I think I agree with both of you, like the things that have already been said. I'd say from a process standpoint, what I do is take that last rolling forecast and that's the starting point of the budget. That said, I think, where am I trying to go with this? I think that this is like also a difference between like what the forecast is and what the budget is, kind of like what Laurent was saying, is we need to make sure that we're having those conversations, that we shouldn't be having those budget type conversations every single month, because they need to operate and run the business and execute on the plan. And then the forecast is something that we should be doing with as little touch as possible from other departments, I think. And then the budget needs to be a much bigger process that's almost separate from the rolling forecast altogether. But in terms of like where the starting point of the forecast is, the rolling forecast, I agree, should be where you start off. And that's also why I made the crying emoji on Santiago's comment, is because this is why Q4 is just so hard for finance people, is we have so many different things going on at once. But that's why we do what we do.
Yeah. So I have a question. Thoughts here between budget and forecast. Should one be top down, bottom up, driver base? Should you be using different methods, or how do you think of that between budget and forecast? Kind of any thoughts there? And we'll go with you first, Derek.
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm going to define what I think is top down and bottom up. Top down to me means, well, it can mean two things, which makes it even more confusing. Top down could mean you're going from a macro perspective and forecasting the business based on what you think your overall industry growth is, or what the overall GDP growth is, for example. It can also mean top down from like a leadership perspective, where leadership is saying, here's what we got to do next year, and you guys just got to figure out how to do that. That's also, to me, what a top down forecast is. And then bottoms up usually means that you're going to the very lowest levels of the business and you're forecasting out what is possible from a capacity standpoint. So you go to your sales team and say, hey, based on your hiring pipeline next year and the goals we have for ARR, like how are you going to hit those goals? So that's I saw a comment from Carolina. I think I agree for the most part. Forecast should be bottom up and budget should be top down. And so the way I see that in practice is budget. We have like a very simple conversation with the CEO, CFO, maybe a few other department heads, and we set high level goals for the next year and say we got to double our growth, or that's true in my industry, but maybe not elsewhere, but double our growth, make sure our LTV CAC is above 3, set some guardrails, and then you go down to the rest of the business and you say, how are we going to make this possible? And you try to get those two plans to match as closely as possible. So the rolling forecast, I always keep it bottoms up, driver based. That's something that I can look at, just how are we trending over the last few months, and let's carry those trends forward, see how close that gets us to our plan that we set at the beginning of the year. And then the annual budget process is a combination of those two, where we start with the top down goals that we need from the board and from senior leadership. And then we go down to the business and say, how are we going to make this happen, and reconcile those two plans as closely as possible.
And what I found, I'll share my experience. Most of the time, it was a combination of both with the rolling forecast and the budget. Because what would happen is I'd put my number, the general manager would look at it before they wanted the CEO to see it, and they'd be like, we got to de-risk, we got to add some more in here. I can't go in with that low of a number. So, and some of the companies I worked at, it's like, I want to keep my job, so we're going to figure it out. And I was like, all right, we'll put the number you want. So there ended up almost always being some kind of management discretion in that. But I agree, in theory, your rolling forecast should be as much as it can. What do you really think is going to happen with finance owning it and getting the necessary inputs to be comfortable with the number versus asking every single person in the business, what's it going to be? Because they're all going to have their different motives. The idea is it's kind of a neutral view of what you think's really going to happen, not budget, which is based on where should we go strategically? Where do we think we need to accomplish? Laurent, your thoughts on that? And then I'm going to go to a question we have here.
I think most of us kind of in agreement that budget is traditionally should be kind of top down and forecast is a bottom up, but I want to expand for a second why. And this is a conversation that I had with dozens of customers and organizations. Some organizations traditionally used to start budgeting as a bottom up. So they send those spreadsheet, or, if you're thinking about modern Word forms of their new EPM tools, to the budget owners, right? And they said, fill them up. And what happens is that they consolidating the data, the management is reviewing that information, said, oh, no, it's too low of a sales, too many discounts, too many new headcounts, right? And that whole process become to be a very back and forth conversation that, hey, budget owners, you ask them to fill whatever they want. So they put in the numbers and now management is pushing back. The whole filling out of this process is really bad, and it makes the whole budget process to be more painful than it needs to be. Now, if we start top down, those budget owners, they should get a framework. And, sometimes they can negotiate a little bit here and there. Sometimes they can move one line item, right, left. That's okay. But at least when they're starting their budgeting, they already get that kind of management alignment. This is our expectations. And without that setting expectation, the whole budgeting process is going completely off rail. This is something that technology cannot solve. This is something that we can do only by creating the right processes in our XP&A, FP&A ecosystem.
I appreciate that. So I want to go to a question we saw here, and we'll start with you, Laurent, on it. So we had a LinkedIn user. I'm not sure who that is, but thank you for joining us. In what ways can we integrate scenario planning into our rolling forecast to better anticipate and prepare for potential market disruptions or opportunities? So any thoughts on that, of how you do a better job of rolling in scenarios to that process?
Yeah, absolutely. My initial answer might be surprising. Technically, when you do forecast, you shouldn't be scenario planning, right? That's my approach, because forecast is literally saying, where are we, where are we going, and that should be kind of standard traditional way of thinking how the business is moving right now. When we speak about scenario planning, that to me is something that is more similar to rebudgeting and rethinking about what we can do. Because literally the idea is that if you say, okay, I have optimistic and pessimistic view, that means that for each and every one of those conversation, you will need to reallocate different resources of the organization, right? So let's say I like to be always positive. So let's say that your forecast is thinking about, we're getting more sales, we're getting more revenues than we anticipated, right? That means you can hire more people or spend more on R&D, right? That's a rebudgeting type of an exercise. So this is not a forecast. To me, a forecast is literally saying, are we going on the path? Yes, no, how much we're going to deviate for that. And if we see a big problem, that's where we do the scenario analysis, only if we are kind of getting a little bit off track.
So how should we think about scenario planning throughout the year? Because if we have scenarios at the beginning, we all talk about how a point estimate is not sufficient. How should we be thinking about that? Maybe making updates throughout the year. How does that process kind of fold into all of this in your view there?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think this is part of a management cadence that the organization needs to decide. Usually, I would say that's where you will do more like a QBRs, the quarterly business review. And that's where you would like to say, okay, let's assume everything going as planned. Let's have all the big brains of the company sitting together and now thinking, can we do something else? Should we change anything, right? And that's how you can think about scenarios. But I think if we are thinking about scenario planning every time you do forecast and combining all of that together, it makes the whole process very, very complicated and difficult. So I like to take big problems and split them into small portions. And to me, scenario planning should be isolated, a little bit different than just the forecasting exercise.
And that makes a lot of sense to me, what you said. I like the way you've laid that out. I haven't thought of it exactly that way, but it makes a lot of sense. Derek, what's your thoughts there on this?
I think, it's interesting. It was surprising to me to hear Laurent say that you don't scenario plan in your forecast, because to me that is forecasting. Is what are the range of outcomes that are possible. I always have different scenarios, usually a base case, an upside case, and a downside case. But when it comes to rolling forecasts, it's a little bit more scientific. I'm not going to the business saying, what do you think is the worst thing that could happen? It's, well, what is the worst that we've got, win rate for your sales team? If it's usually 30%, but 1 month you had 15%, that becomes the downside case. And you change. So on your downside case, 15% win rate is going to bring down your total revenue. That's kind of how I think about scenario planning, is just based on all of the things that we've seen in the past. And if you don't have that much history, maybe you make things up as what you think are the downside and upside case. But I like to see a range of outcomes and then project out, here's our revenue for the next 12 months, here's our cash for the next 12 months, and show the range between those three scenarios of what could happen.
I only have one issue with what you said. You don't say make things up. You say make educated guesses. Come on, Derek. You gotta get the management lingo down. We're helping the younger generation here.
But actually, I think that semantics is very important, because that means, Derek, that when I'm thinking about scenario planning and the way you're thinking about scenario planning, that's a little bit different, right? Because you're saying to me, scenario planning is like what type of accuracy I can bring the forecast in. And if I'm not sure in one prediction, I might be giving 2 or 3 different predictions into my forecast. I'm thinking about the scenario more as something that you say, okay, we want to change something in the business and we want to simulate, right, like a different path that the business is taking. You're saying to me scenario is even different level of accuracy or different cases of the same prediction without changing anything. It's just different.
Yeah.
And this is where you get into a little bit of sensitivity versus scenario, a little bit of what you're doing there, Derek, even though it's best case, worst case, is a little bit of a sensitivity in trying to figure out ranges. Where I think the distinction, if you think of what scenario planning technically, if you want to use a definition, it should be, it's really about, okay, what does my company look like if there's a recession or if there's a government regulation change, or different clear scenarios where you can map it out and then make a decision. Should we switch to the scenario? But the reality is there's a blurring. There's times when scenario and sensitivity kind of get mixed together. So there's a lot of nuance in how we define this, as you guys are seeing here. Just the three of us talking, we haven't aligned on what this looks like. And I'm going to guess if everybody else here would speak, they might have a little different nuance. So the reality is, and I think this really highlights a good point that I want to share, and then we'll do 1 or 2 more questions here. Let anyone else share any comments, and we'll wrap up a little early today. I think this highlights there isn't one way to do this. There is no perfect way to forecast, to budget, to do rolling forecast scenario, sensitivity, top down, bottom up. There's a reason why people do it different ways. There's a reason why there's ideas like beyond budgeting, and some people say budgeting altogether sucks. And I'm going to use I use that term loosely, but a different method, right? You have to do what works for your company. And there are guidelines and principles that are important. And there are ideas that people need to have. But when you get into the nitty gritty, there are as many different ways to do this as there are forecasts out there. And it's not that one's right or one's wrong. There are some best practice and guides we should all be using. But, beyond that, there's definitely a lot of room for discretion. So let's see if we got any other questions. We had one here coming from Vernique. And I'll throw this one to you, Laurent, first, because I know when you were at JDocs, there's definitely a lot of talk around this and use of kind of predictive analytics. So your take from your perspective, having been in the tool vendors and trying to provide this to customers of using AI and predictive analytics and forecasting.
Yeah, so let's go for a second for commercials, because we just completed the 4 meetings sessions about AI in Plan Buddies, and we discussed about that topic. So and we will probably going to do that session again and speak more deeply into the AI and the different tools and so on. So I think the first piece when we are talking about AI is the biggest question is like AI, what type of AI? And I think Veronique, you already mentioned here like predictive analytics. My answer is absolutely yes. There are many organizations that are using and have been using AI for prediction. This is something that happened definitely starting maybe to accelerate over the past couple of months, but I've seen that for the past 3 to 5 years coming up, mostly not as a full exercise, but mostly for the recurring type of businesses. Now, some of them using forecast just to estimate whatever oil price or whatever it's depending for them. Some software vendor I used to work with, they use that in order to predict their churn or renewal rates and so on. And that was giving excellent results. When I tested AI a couple of times, it was fairly quickly to get into 98% accuracy, at least from months over months. So not maybe for 12 months prediction, but with simple tools, you can get nice accuracy for the next couple of quarters, 1-2 quarters, as long as the business is fairly standard and as long as the forecasting is being done in a high level. Very little companies can really do accurate forecasting with not huge resources on a detailed level yet. So I haven't seen that working if you're really doing it by a customer, but if you do it by segment, by region, by months, that's something that companies are using and definitely helpful and pretty accurate.
Yeah, and I'll share 2 examples real quick here. I attended an AFP session that was done by Microsoft where they shared how they implemented AI in their planning. They use Fin, which they've made open source to anyone, their code, and they used a bunch of different models, and how they rolled it out is they rolled it out to provide it as a resource to the business. They would review it and they could use it if they thought it was right, or they could make adjustments or use their own plan. And as they tracked it, they were finding the AI was better in most cases than the end user for revenue. They also use it for real estate now. They don't use it in every area of the business, but they're continuing to roll it out. And I also know, and I've interviewed, was on a FP&A today, a lady by the name of Kat Orakova. She was in data science, a mathematics degree. She was working in product at Facebook, and they were 10% off on their daily. They did a daily forecast for trying to understand things. This is when they were first public, and they were getting beat up by the market because FP&A was really struggling to forecast. So they brought in the data science team and said, let's try a different approach. She was the first data science team in finance and FP&A, and they got it to where they were within 2% every day on what their revenue would be using AI. So it's definitely been used. Now, it's becoming more and more citizen data science, and over time it will be easier and easier for the masses to use, but you still need a certain level of data and different things for accuracy, right? The less data you have, the smaller the company, the more difficult it may be, but we're definitely seeing it become easier and easier. So I would say A lot of companies are using it. I wouldn't say most companies by any means, but the data from FP&A Trends said companies that are using AI ML had 10%. Well, actually, they had 22% higher satisfaction in their forecast than the general population. They're better forecasts in general. That doesn't mean you don't need human judgment. You can't just rely on AI, but that's what I would add to that. And we'll go to Derek. Any thoughts on that, Derek?
Yeah, so my last company right before Circle, we had a predictive model for forecasting duration of reservations. So I worked at a company that was like Airbnb, but for storage. And so we had multi-month reservations of storage that were going through our platform. And that model was actually really good. It had an accuracy of 96% when back tested, and it continued to be about that accurate going forward. So our recurring GMV revenue model, we got a lot better once we started using that predictive model to forecast out revenue. And I think that's a really good use case for any company that has a recurring nature to their business. So that's something I'm working with our data team at Circle now, is building a model that does basically the same thing. Like, how is this customer that we just acquired, based on everything we know about them from their free trial, from what campaign they came from, all those different things, how much revenue they're doing, use those different features to predict how they're going to retain in the future. So those are some real life use cases that I've seen every day at work, and it's just a way to make your models more predictive.
And I'll recommend an article. I think it's on Equal's website. I believe they published it. They tell the story in detail of Snowflake. I got an early copy of it. Snowflake was quite off on their forecasts, and their new CFO said, we're not going public till we're more accurate. It ain't happening. So figure it out. And it was like a 2-year journey where they used a lot of data science, and they completely had to redo things a couple times, and a long journey. And they got to where they were very accurate, enough that the CFO was comfortable. And it's a really fascinating story of how they had to go about it. They hit the limit with their FP&A team, and they had to bring in some data science people, and just kind of their journey to figure out what the right mix is and how to do it. And so if you get a chance, read that. And then I want to go to one question, and then we're going to wrap up here, or one comment. So I like this one. I think this is Aaron. He said, increased stakeholder confidence explanation. Showing that you have considered multiple future scenarios can increase stakeholder confidence in your planning processes and reassure them that you're well prepared for various outcomes. Agree, being able to do that in your quarterly to show you strategically thought about, if a recession comes, we're prepared. If there's a boom, if there's a black swan, right? You want to have confidence in management, and knowing they thought about different things brings confidence. But I'll add one thing, kind of, as you mentioned this, that made me think of in stakeholder confidence. There's a guy by the name, and I'll laugh when I say this, Jeff Epstein, not Jeffrey Epstein. He's a part of Besmeyer Venture Partners. He used to be the CFO of Oracle. And he talks about how it's a different budget and a different level of confidence for your external, for your public versus your internal, and how you think about it. And he called the article, and if you Google it, you'll find it. It was how to build a Goldilocks budget that's just right. And he talks about the different mentalities. Like Elon Musk always throws out some huge targets and never comes close. And others he gives his view of how to think about each of them. Your sales forecast, those operational pieces, your public, your budget, each of them, kind of what his preference is on accuracy. And it's a really good read, because it just makes you think how many different opinions there are out there, and how to think about all this, and that there's the strategic element to budgeting and forecasting. So if you get a chance, I would encourage that. We're going to go here and just give our panelists an opportunity to add any final words before we conclude. So we'll go with you, Laurent, first, and then we'll give our youngin the last word.
Yeah, I think we covered many interesting topics, and I hope to keep this conversation going in the community. Maybe one piece we didn't cover, and we just started to raise that, is the importance of forecast and accurate forecast for investors. We are thinking about that mostly from an operational perspective. Okay, what are we doing if we have more or less than what we planned? But definitely with investors, that the trust of the company. And if our forecast is accurate, we get more confidence from investors, whether that's a private company, VCP held and definitely a public company, if you can, and that's the reason why Snowflake's were CFO was so anxious about providing accurate forecasts. So that's maybe another angle to speak about on our next conversation about forecast.
Derek.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to add. I think that it's helpful to keep it in the sense of the broader FP&A cycle at your business. Why are we forecasting? It's not always an accuracy game. In some senses, it is when you're giving numbers to the street type of thing. But within the business, it's about just making sure we're steering the business in the right direction and using the forecast as a tool to do that. Using it as like the rudder to say if we move this lever this way, what direction are we going to end up in? What's our ultimate destination if we continue to perform like this? And so keeping it high level in terms of results and making sure that we're charting the business's course to a place that we want to end up as a company is probably the most important part of any forecast or any FP&A process.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that really kind of brings it into perspective, what you said there about just the importance of helping move the business forward than being accurate. So thank you for joining us. Again, please come over and check out Plan Buddies. We'd love to have you join the community. We're about 75 strong or so right now, and always looking for great voices to carry these conversations forward. And feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions. We'll respond to you. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us in the Plan Buddies community. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.